Hello and welcome to Memories of Pride. This is Derek Newman still, and I'm here with Jen Seeley, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Pride and Jen's memories of Pride and Jen's experiences of Pride. Jen, can you tell us a little bit about first of all, just to start out, what does Pride mean for you?
Oh Lord, pride. What does pride mean for me? I mean, pride has had a lot of different meanings, I think, over time, and it's evolved, kind of personally, but I think also culturally as well.
Yeah,
But for me, pride is this is a hard thing to answer,
yeah.
apparently. It shouldn't be though. I think that's the thing about pride. Pride just is. For me, pride is a place of I just called it a place. I'm feeling very inarticulate at the moment. Derek, you've really thrown me for a
I'm so sorry. It's
That's
a
okay.
complex question, right? Like
It's
we think
well,
we
yeah.
think pride as something so simple, and it's really not, right? It's
I'm,
complex.
I'm exactly. I think that's exactly what's happening. Like to sort of like kind of smush it into this little tiny definition feels really hard.
Absolutely.
Um, for me, like when you ask that question, it takes me back to my first ever Pride, which was in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and
Yeah.
yeah, and it was a little bitty thing in comparison to what I've become accustomed to living in Toronto. But also it was this intimate gathering of folks that also was a place where I really felt that I was able to spread some wings. And I think that that looks very different for everyone, right? Like the wings that we want to spread are different one person to another, but I think there's something about pride as I keep wanting to call it a place, and so I guess maybe that's right for me right now. Pride as a place, um, instead of like not really a location so much as it's just a place of being.
Abs-
Um, yeah,
We exist in pride.
exist in pride, exactly. And I guess pride is also made complicated, right? When we think of corporate pride and we think of um the ways in which what was originally, really just a radical movement, the ways that it's been co-opted by the world around us, and also the expectations around pride.
Wow.
I hear of a lot of folks too that when they talk of pride, they talk of like they've done their time at pride, like they've been there, done that kind of thing. So there's so again, it feels a bit like a place, right? Like they
It,
put in their time and now they feel proud. It's like it's almost like it's like
a project that gets completed somehow.
I
Like
don't know, maybe not for some people, but yeah, like the more pride you do, the more proud you become, and we reach this level of I don't know if that really happens for folks, but
it's
pride is
interesting.
also really special.
Yeah. I noticed you mentioned corporate pride as well. How do you feel about that intersection of corporations and capitalism with pride and turning pride into things like a tourist destination rather than a radical act or an act of celebration of community?
Largely, I hate it.
Yeah.
It's and I say largely because there's a little piece of me that also recognizes that for the itty bitty baby queers and the folks who haven't had space to really come out and to be like experiencing or like spreading those wings like I was talking about. I find that in some cases, in some cities and some towns, the ways in which a pride event actually ends up happening is because of some of those corporations, unfortunately, or at least in part they help to make the event come together. So I know that especially for little baby queers who are who maybe travel to Toronto, for example, and see a great big giant corporate pride for the first time, it feels very exciting to be part of something so massive and so giant. So while I absolutely hate it, I also see that there's been um, a few folks who've benefited by being able to access more stuff. That
Yeah,
being said, I really wish that wasn't the case, I guess is really where I'm at.
absolutely. There's so much potential for like a large pride to be able to do interesting things, but in a lot of cases it seems to get away from the individual pride, right? Like
Yeah.
the the little experiential stuff. Having TD stamped on your flags, for example, is just not the same as the sort of like, I made my flag out of paper.
Right, or it's like a hand-stitched flag. Exactly. And yet in, like, this microwave generation of, everything 30 seconds or less, there's something really nice about being able to be handed, I know for me it wasn't TD, but I remember a winner's flag.
Yeah,
Like, being handed a winner's flag makes it feel very accessible also. So, like, there's this and I think that's what they want, right? The corporations, they want you to feel as though you're just, like, unable to live without them in order for these events to be, to take off without a hitch and to be really successful. Um,
nicely
so
said.
it's really it's a give and take.
Yeah.
I can stand to have without be without it. And that's like the very first Pride I mentioned that I ever attended was in Fredericton, and it was and it was beautiful. And when I lived in Peterborough for a while, I used to tell folks back home that Peterborough reminded me of a very large Fredericton. There was so many ways in which Peterborough was, and that's not just the Pride as well, but just Peterborough as a general city. Is
Absolutely.
Peterborough a city? It is, isn't it?
Yeah, yep,
Yeah, I can't get cities and towns straight in
me
Ontario
neither.
because in New Brunswick, everything is "we." Um, but, yeah, Peterborough was very much like, a very large New Brunswick, and in a lot of the ways, in the way the city is laid out, and the people who are there, and what you can access. And then the Pride event there also felt very similar to that Pride back home in Fredericton, in that it was, um well, there's no giant TD floats and Trojan floats, in a parade, and it's very community, like, driven, and it feels like community, um, and that's, what that first Pride for me in Fredericton really felt like was coming home. It's a homecoming.
Absolutely. Well, and I was so excited that we actually got to meet at one of Peterborough's prides,
Yeah.
and we got a chance to get to know each other that way. And I think there's something really interesting about Peterborough's pride, Peterborough-Nogojiwanong's pride, because it is fairly small. We don't have the mass to be able to do what Toronto does and separate individual populations out, which I think is a good thing. We don't just have like gay men hanging out with gay men. We don't have lesbians hanging out with lesbian women. We don't
Yeah.
have trans folks clustering together either. We have that because we're a smaller community. At least for me, it feels like we've got some intermixing. How about for you? What was it like?
Definitely that way. I know that for me, my first experiences of, I guess, like, queer community in Peterborough,
Yeah.
in general, where were like that because I was in Peterborough for a short time, living at a good friend's place who's also a professor at Trent, who's also queer, um, and attending, Fleming, doing, a diploma at Fleming, and,
Fantastic.
um and so, like, I noticed that even just on campus there, that all the queer kids kind of, like, collected together regardless of their, like, various, social locations and identities and labels, and that was kinda cool. But my larger, I think, intro to, like, queer community in Peterborough was, um, I volunteered at Parn, and,
Right.
um, and then also did, a like an internship at Parn for a bit, worked there for a tiny bit afterwards as well. And so one of the things that I also was part of while interning and working and volunteering at Parn was Pride stuff. And so it
Wow.
kind of like landed me on the Pride committee. And I remember one day, speaking of parades, like very different than how the Toronto parade probably gets put together, though, like bless whoever does that because it's pretty huge. But I remember Anya and I with sticky notes down this hallway
Yes.
Tarn and just kind of like hopping them around to try and like find the like best position in the parade for all of the participants, right?
Oh, I
And
love
like just
that.
all the participants were on sticky notes. And so it was very intimate in even those ways, like the little details of how things came together was really sweet and lovely. And I met a lot of people through not just Pride events, but through Parn events as well.
Yeah.
And also like queer events in the city that were not necessarily related to either, but because of working at Pirate and being there, like I also would hear about because I made friends there who were also, queer and um I there was like a queer youth group through Parn as well that I, like hopped in and was part of, like from a facilitator kind of like lens. And I took on a bunch of stuff at the school as well, like that were also all very much like um drawing in and finding the queer crowd. So it was really cool to see, like you're saying, like this cross spectrum of the trans folks, the gay men, the lesbians, the bi folks, like the pan folks, like everyone was just kind of like collected all together. And you really saw that when the event came through, when
Absolutely.
Pride happened, you really just saw this really sweet community that wasn't like kind of mashed together, like, or mashed together but apart of like cliques, kind of
Yeah.
like in eighth grade dance, right? You get the boys in
Yeah.
one corner and the girls in another. That's kind of how it feels sometimes at larger prides, where like groups of folks are just really, understandably too, because people like to see themselves in the world. So we do tend to gravitate towards folks that we're most alike. But in a smaller place, there's an even bigger meaning in like the differences in me recognize the differences in you. The queerness in me recognizes the queerness in you, and that could be enough
Yeah.
in like a really large set, like, or a larger center, where it feels like, cis heteronormativity is like the
Everywhere.
one culture and everywhere. It just feels so nice to connect with a person who's in some way weird.
Yeah.
um and I use that word quite interchangeably as like a neurodivergent queer person. Like lots of things make me weird, and for which I'm really grateful.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because you've hinted at a number of different things that you've done over the course of your life in Peterborough and at home and in Toronto. Sorry, I'm using New Brunswick as at home, uh, which I figure will definitely, as I know you, would definitely apply. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about who you are, how you connect to queerness, and some of the different hats you've worn over the years?
Oh Lord, where to begin? Um, so I guess today, these days, my biggest identities are I am a a fat autistic non-binary queer therapist living in
Yes.
Toronto, and recently got married to the love of my life. And
Congratulations.
thank you. It was a really big gay wedding. Gotta love those. Um, I have lived in Toronto for 10 years, and with a couple of exceptions of being in Peterborough for parts of that. I say I've lived here for 10 years, but there was a part of that I was in Peterborough.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess I just call it that because I'm from New Brunswick originally, so I'm a little tiny maritime person from a town originally with a population of 900. So it's a huge difference living in a big city. And um, I'm a cat parent.
Yes.
And a witch and an artist, and those are kind of some of who I am. And
So fabulous.
thank you. Yeah, that's and as far as some of the hats I've worn, I think the most funny slash interesting ones to acknowledge or share are that once upon a time, Jesus and I were really tight, and I was also a youth pastor way
Oh,
back when.
really?
Yeah,
Oh, I had no idea. It's
yeah.
funny how you can know someone for a number of years and find out about different hats they've worn over time.
Mhm.
That's
It's a
amazing.
very different hat. Yeah, yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about what you do through your counseling practice? Because I know we've chatted and basically I know that you helped me find an amazing therapist. You're like the therapist matchmaker. I think I called you for a number of years.
Forgotten about that. I'd forgotten that I hooked you up. I think I've hooked so many people up because finding a good therapist is so, 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 so important. And I feel really blessed to have been part of this really cool collective here. It's kind of like I say here in Toronto, but because we keep spreading out all over the place, and because the pandemic has allowed folks to work remotely, it's no longer exclusive to just Toronto, but there is a really great collection of trans, queer, trans and or queer. Some people don't like to use those words interchangeably. Some people do. So I'm honoring all of that.
Right.
Therapists here in Toronto. And what's great about being part of that collective is that we can also reach out to one another for referrals. Also, for loads of other things like sharing trainings and other interesting bits and bobs that happen in our city and abroad. And it's a really great place to learn of. We talk, you and I have talked earlier today, for other reasons. We were talking about doctors and medical institutions.
Yeah.
Um, and so, that's also a place where people will sometimes share exciting things like, oh Lord, I found a really cool queer doctor. And they're taking patients still. Quick, tell your clients, um,
The insider network, right? On who's safe.
insider network, 100%. And so that's been really, really useful and helpful. But my practice, I've been in practice for a little over 5 years, and my practice is primarily queer folks. I would say if I could make up a statistic right now, because I love making up math, it's probably 95% queer.
Amazing.
And the clients who I have that aren't queer are largely queer adjacent.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, they could be folks who are practicing various forms of non-monogamy, or,
Yeah.
involved in kink. Um, so things that feel very much like alternative, sexual practices, alternative orientations, etc., that are not really necessarily directly under the queer umbrella.
Right. Right.
Um, so those are the folks who mostly find me. And also, if I made up another statistic, I would say that probably at least 80% of my clients are neurodivergent. And so I have a lot of clients who are autistic and or have ADHD, um, many of whom know that coming in the door. Some of them learn that while we work together. And yeah, so like lots of really interesting intersections of queerness,
Yeah.
of neurodivergence, also of other various forms of disability. And um, yeah, I'd have to say it's a really huge honor to get to work with these folks.
This is sort of my side interest that I'm sure everyone knows about, but can you talk a little bit about that intersection between queerness and disability, especially between that intersection of queerness and neurodiversity as well?
Yeah. So interestingly, I mean, it's I was gonna say it's no secret, but it could be to someone watching and listening, that maybe it is a secret, but there's a really big prevalence of neurodivergence in trans folks, especially trans and non-binary folks. But we find a lot of neurodivergence in queerness, period. And um, what are the reasons? Like, it's still kind of like there are a lot of theories, and so it's still very much not necessarily nailed down. And also, like, I don't need a theory or anything else to tell me that it's cool that I have the neuro spicy brain that I have, and I'm also
Oh,
queer
I love
non-binary
the
person.
term. Oh, I love neurospicy. Thank you.
Neurospicy is the best. Um, and so like we see it happening a lot, right? And um the other things that we see happening a lot are like probably most of my clients have at some point in their life been either diagnosed or self-diagnosed as having anxiety. It's so flippin' common. And what's interesting as well is that a lot of times, especially autistic brains, tend to end up being misdiagnosed as having anxiety.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that anxiety isn't its own thing and that a neurodivergent person can't also have anxiety, because you can. But I find that, like, interestingly, when we think about queerness and transness, and we think that there are already so many ways in which the world doesn't necessarily intersect with what is most important to us, because there's all this straightness and right, like all of the societal norms are very much not built the way we need them to be built. um there are a lot of reasons to be anxious. There are a lot of reasons to be uncomfortable. There are a lot of reasons to be questioning,
Yeah.
um, you know, parts of ourselves, including like all those internalized things, like internalized homophobia and all the shame that folks can feel for not somehow fitting. And when we think about those things through the lens of neurodivergence, especially unidentified or unknown neurodivergence in a person, it makes a lot of sense that it gets classified as anxiety.
Absolutely.
So I'm seeing a lot of folks, especially, I think the pandemic has also really been a big contributor. And I'm hearing that like broadly, right? It's been a big contributor to folks, to adults finding that learning new things about their brains.
Yeah.
And it's not exclusive to queer folks, but like a lot of grown people are looking back and realizing the ways in which they were missed as kids and
Right?
the ways in which they're probably not neurotypical. So it's been a really cool, to me, really cool kind of explosion of discovery of neurodivergence over the past couple of years, especially.
I can only imagine, and it's so amazing to be able to be a guide through that discovery process, right? To be
Mhm.
able to go alongside your clients, to be able to find basically like where they've come from, how where they're going, how they process all of this that's happening to them.
Yeah,
That's so exciting.
it's pretty cool. I'm not gonna lie.
So speaking of queerness, how would you define queerness? What, I guess a definition is really not what I'm looking for. How does queerness feel for you?
Ooh, how does queerness feel for me? Interesting question. I like that. I think that queerness feels simultaneously um hard at times
Yeah.
and sparkly at times. Queerness is very queerness very rarely now. I think that over time I feel very very privileged to be able to say that, having worked through like through the many years of, well, like I said earlier, about having been a youth pastor, for example, and having to come from, you know, like the juxtaposition of like queerness and God
Mhm.
and how I felt about that. And side note, lots of queer folks are also religious in a variety of different, religions, and I love that relationship that they are able to have. And that includes Christians. There are people who are queer and Christian. That's no longer a path for me. I just like to notice that I feel that there's a lot of really cool stuff happening
Abs-
um, in different religious circles where queers are being more more cared for and seen and accepted, and I'm glad for that, but it's not always the case. But back to that question of like that journey of queer, like it's been hard at times too to like really especially, in the earlier years of really being able um really being able to be you
mhm.
and feeling okay to be you, right? Because there's so many messages from so many different directions, or there can be for some of us that are saying this isn't okay, or are you sure, or this is a hard path to take, and why would you choose this? And and yet at the same time, queerness is so freeing, right? um,
Absolutely.
Queerness is so big, and like I just had this big queer wedding, and it was really cool to have all this feedback from folks, in particular the straight folks in the crowd who were just like, wow, you really did it the way you wanted to do it. And it was just really great to not feel like we had to conform to
Absolutely.
anything but our own dreams and desires. So we
Absolutely.
did.
I love that, and especially that queerness gives us the space to not necessarily follow tradition either, right? Like, we have the ability to be like, "We're finding our own traditions because there aren't any for us."
Yeah, isn't that great?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
freeing, right?
yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's fantastic. So this year's theme for Peterborough-Nogojiwanong Pride, Peterborough-Nogojiwanong Pride, sorry, is joy and resistance.
That sounds great.
And I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit about what queer joy means to you? Just to start out, what is
uh,
queer joy? How do we experience that jouissance, that love of being queer?
I'm gonna sound like a broken record, and I don't apologize for that. uh the wedding that we just had was queer joy. I
Yeah.
just want to start there. And it's not because we did a thing that traditionally, um, like heterosexual folks do, like cool, fine, whatever. It's not because of that. And it's not because it was a wedding that it automatically was joy, because I mean, I've been to some weddings that were just okay.
Mhm.
Sorry to those folks. But uh, I won't name you. Um, but there was just something about being able to, celebrate and be celebrated.
Yeah,
And so I think that, I mean, if you'd asked me this question, Derek, like 2 weeks ago, I
yeah,
think my answer would have been largely different, not that it would have been also wrong, but I think it's because of this wedding, like, it was mind-blowing to feel so celebrated. I'm still crying about it, like, it for days, I would just cry. Every moment, I would think about the people who showed up for us and the ways they showed up, and, um, I keep telling people, like, I felt so held. I
yeah,
felt so seen, so held, so supported, so loved, so cared for with every toast, with every action, with the sharing of our vows, like everything that happened at that wedding felt like queer joy.
yeah,
Quite explosive, like in the biggest and most beautiful ways. And I remember like driving home from, because it was just a little outside the city. And so we stayed at a hotel for the weekend. And on Sunday, driving home, actually just a week ago. Wow. I've been married for a week, y'all. So last
congratulations.
Sunday, thank you. Last Sunday, just driving home, and then like my spouse and I kind of laughing that maybe I should pull over because I was just reflecting and remembering, and like the tears are just like,
Oh, that's beautiful.
and it really was, it felt beautiful. And I've just never felt so held. And I think that as queer people, I don't think that we should have to get married. Absolutely
Exactly.
not. And I don't think that we should need to have any particular large event specifically in order to have those feelings. But I feel like we deserve those feelings and that we need to lean into them when they exist, and that they do exist when we have a community and,
Yeah,
circles of people who really, see us and where we can be seen. And it's something that I want for all of us. And I think that small events, I shouldn't say Peterborough Pride is not a small event, but like smaller towns and smaller cities in particular, when there is that um, really great mix, like we were talking about earlier, where people aren't so separate in their little cliques. I think that there's a really nice holding and feeling. Those are my feelings of Peterborough Pride, when leaving there, that how beautiful and like community connecting it felt like to be part of this larger event where I didn't know everyone, where I didn't know you until I met you,
yeah, exactly.
right? And it just felt so beautiful, and not like I was just one person in a giant sea of people and then we all went our separate ways, right? It just,
Absolutely. I
yeah,
love that idea of queer joy being that feeling of being held, because I think that's so important when we're held up by our community, when we're holding each other together. I think that's a really powerful emotion and a really powerful act of community, right?
yeah.
Now, the other part, resistance. Uh,
Resistance.
what does queer resistance mean for you, and why is it important?
Queer resistance is beautiful. And queer resistance is so like also can't be just wrapped up into an easy definition. For some people, it probably can be, but I'm not articulate in that way. I like to use lots of words and
Loquaciousness.
loquaciousness. And I think that for me, one of the things that feels really important around like what is queer resistance is the recognition that there's so many ways to resist,
Yes.
because it's so easy to look at the folks who are, charging in and shouting out, and who are rushing to change, and who are writing like, just furiously and sending letters and showing up with signs, and like those folks are super important. But there are other ways to also resist, and there are other ways to show up, and there are other roles to play. And I feel like often when we talk about something like queer resistance as important, and well, it's integral, like we wouldn't be here without queer resistance. Queer resistance allows us to exist. um Queer resistance allows us to um connect, and queer resistance allows us to like come together. It's because of that that we can actually be present with one another. And so it's really important, but I think that there are lots of folks who feel lost in that definition, or who feel lost in that phrase, if you will, like, because they don't see themselves, like marching down a street and standing face to face with a cop somewhere and a brick in hand. And it's not a thing they can imagine doing ever in their lives. Um, and they feel like they're not part in some way, shape, or form. But there are so many ways in which we resist. We resist with our dollars. We spend our money. We spend our time. We spend our labor in whatever way, shape, and form that is, whether it's licking envelopes. We don't really do that anymore, but right, like whatever it is that we can offer, just because we're not the poster child, or the one, with the canister of tear gas and a mask on, and just because we don't have the brick in hand doesn't mean we don't have bricks in hand. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because we need not just the folks in the front, we need the folks who support them.
So
So,
nicely said. Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's so important, and especially to recognize that we're all contributing in different ways, right? And I think a lot about the way that queer bodies are resistant bodies, even just based on the fact that we don't fit in to heterosexist, cisgendered life. Um, we're
Yeah.
automatically seen as outsiders, and by embracing that outsiderness, we're also doing an act of resistance.
Yeah, 100%.
That's so
Yeah.
fantastic. So, what are our next steps for Pride? Where do you see us going from here? What are some things that you're like, I would love to see this in Pride in the future?
Wow, I haven't really chewed on that. That's a really great question. I mean, I think I just really hope, I'm gonna use that word, I really hope for a continued space and time and whatever other,
Yeah.
defining words we want to give to it, um, where more people see themselves. And that's so broad, I realize, but I feel like the more we can show up in our different ways and also feel seen in
Yeah.
different ways feels really important. I feel like, just like, the first Pride being a riot and Pride being what it was once upon a time, how Pride is evolving. Pride evolves because we evolve, I feel. And I feel like, as we continue to evolve, Pride needs to also, and to include more folks in more ways, because when I look at queer youth today, I feel like this feels almost like it's a bit of a, I feel, I hope that someone said, like 20 years ago, when I look at queer youth today, it just
Yeah.
feels like this is a thing that will be continually played. That when we look at queer youth, we should feel inspired. Um,
Yeah.
we see, like so many people talking about, how the gay agenda and how we've made them all gay. And I'm just like, well, no, kids are just growing up in a place, in a space where they're taking up more of it, and feeling a bit more permitted to experiment with the things they're questioning and to be more truly themselves. And it's exciting.
Yeah.
Um, and so with that though also comes all these various forms of queerness, right? Like we used to be able to, and I don't like, listen, we could be here all day trying to like label all the really fun like sub labels of, right? But
Yeah,
once upon a
exactly.
time, once upon a time there was like, it felt like there was fewer categories to lump one into. And now, you and I as non-binary people, right? Like, um,
Especially as folks that came to non-binary identities later in life as well,
yes, that also.
right? And I think for me at least, I learned so much from youth to get here. They created
Yes,
the language that I needed that we didn't have,
yes,
right?
yes, 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 yes. 100%. And I think that that's what's really beautiful. And so when I think of the future of Pride, it has to involve the youth. It has to include the youth, and it has to listen to the youth. I
Absolutely.
think that that's, without the youth, like Pride will die.
Yeah,
I feel
exactly.
that way.
And
Yeah.
we've got so many more steps to take, and that's something that's exciting too, right? Like, it's not something totally daunting. We've got far to go still, and yet it's an exciting adventure to get there.
Yeah, 100%.
I want to thank you so much for taking time out to chat with me today. Is there anything else you want to add in that you think is important for us to think about as Pride in Peterborough-Nogojiwanong has reached its 20th year?
I just really wanna say that some of my sweetest Pride times have been, in at Peterborough Pride, and I'm really grateful, to have been part of, Pride and Pride events there, and, glad to have met you there, as well as a number of really cool folks. I'm just so happy to see that it's year 20 and y'all are doing great. I hope to make it out this year.
Thank you so much, Jen. This has been so wonderful, and I'm just so glad that we were able to get your voice included. And thank you for all of your brilliant, brilliant insights and the changes that you've also advocated for. You've done so much work in our community, so thank you.
Thanks, Derek. It was really sweet and a pleasure.